Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first part of Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is all about human processes. So, in our module last week, we discussed all of our physical processes, landforms, earthquakes, mountain ranges. And this week, we're going to look at all of the human processes. Next week, we're going to move on to our first region, which is Europe. And so, all of these themes that have come up in physical processes and human processes, we will talk about again as we look at these regions. So here is a picture of the port and skyline of Singapore. And so as geographers, we want to know, like, how did that wind up being a port? How did that city become so big? What is the quality of life like there? And so the first thing that we're going to talk about in this lecture, this first part is development. And so we talk about development in a couple of different ways. You might hear the terms developed or developing. Your textbook uses more developed countries and less developed countries. We could talk about it in terms of industrialized or industrializing. Generally speaking, those countries, like the ones in Europe, although there was uneven development across Europe even, or the United States, who arrived at that industrial revolution first, had an economic advantage. And finally, my least favorite, first world and third world, which I don't very much like that term because it sounds as if some countries are somehow better than others. We might also hear the term today emerging economies, which is usually used for those countries who are in the middle, not considered the most developed, but certainly not considered the least. India and China are often referred to as emerging economies. They have a very growing economy, lots of exports, and a growing middle class. And so what exactly do we mean by more developed? Economically speaking, you're talking about high income, high consumption also. So we need something to spend all of that money on. And generally, it is stuff. And not just stuff, but more energy, more water use, more land use, more fossil fuel use. You have a strong middle class. And so, in a lot of very underdeveloped countries, what you have is a lot of people, or a small segment of the population who is very wealthy, and then a large segment of the population is very poor, and there's not many people in between. So, you might hear a lot of discussions going on with our country when people say, oh, our middle class is shrinking, we need to save our middle class, we need to help the middle class. And one of the reasons is that a strong middle class is considered a good indicator that you are in a healthy economy. Generally speaking, they are more urban. Globally, as a threshold, we have passed the 50% mark. More than 50% of us now live in urban areas. Some really developed countries are 90% urban, and some other ones that are less developed are much, much less than that, well under 25%. Good infrastructure, we can see here is Auckland, New Zealand, the port right there. We are in a more developed country. We generally expect that if we dial 911, an ambulance is going to show up, that we're going to be able to get on the freeway in the morning and go where we're going, or get on the trolley or the train, and everything is pretty much going to work. We have clean water, ideally, that's coming out of our pipes. We flip on the light and the electricity happens. From a human standpoint, we're going to have a longer life expectancy for all the reasons that you could think of: access to healthcare and medicine, less danger from pollutants or disease. We're also going to have a lower population growth. When we get into the second part of this chapter, we're going to talk about demographics and the demographic transition model, and we'll talk about why that is. Also, high rates of education. Generally speaking, in a lot of less developed countries, either there is not very much education available, or people cannot afford that education, whether that just means that they can't afford to not work from a very young age. And this tends to disproportionately affect women. The other thing I wanted to say about the economics is, if we see on the bottom here is a picture of a shopping center in San Marcos. And if we look here, we have a bunch of different businesses. A couple of them are food, but for the most part, we don't have a lot of manufacturing happening here, right? In more developed countries, it's more of a service industry. More people are working in that service industry, less people are working in factories making stuff as opposed to right now in a lot of our less developed countries or emerging economies, that's where we're making a lot of the stuff that we're buying. And so, what do I mean by less developed, right? We talked about more developed. Economically, you're going to have a lower income. You're going to use a lot less resources, have a lot less consumption. And so, you're going to eat less food, use less water, buy less clothes, use a lot less energy. You're going to have a lot more inequality. So, by inequality, we're talking about that gap between the rich and the poor, and there not being a lot of people in the middle. It's going to be more rural in many of these cases. At the top there, you can see a cattle herder in Lesotho. Um, so you have more people living a subsistence agriculture lifestyle, so people who are growing their own food and selling less of it to a market. Infrastructure is lacking. So here's a picture in Malaysia, which is this picture is in an urban area, but the power here may or may not work all the time. So people have a satellite just hanging off the side there. You may or may not have a good sewer system, which a lot of urban slums do not have. And from the human perspective, we're going to have a shorter life expectancy, less access to medicine, more chance of contracting some type of disease, very high population growth. And we'll talk about why that is in our next part of this chapter. Less education for those reasons that I mentioned on the previous slide. And lastly, I just wanted to mention inequality. Inequality is not just a aspect of less developed economies. We'll talk a little bit more about inequality, but this also takes place in developed countries. Inequality in the United States has been increasing over the past several years. And we also have uneven development within cities. These are two maps. One is of Detroit in the United States, and the other one is in Cape Town, South Africa. So this happens in a wide variety of countries. But with those red dots there, you're going to look at some street views from Google after this, and you're going to see places that are very, very close together, but they look like they come from very, very different places. Especially in places like Detroit and Cape Town, you could really just go 3/4 of a mile away and feel like you're in an entirely different place. One of the ways that we talk about development and measure development from a human perspective is something called the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index looks at life expectancy, literacy, and income. 1 is considered a perfect score by the UN. No countries have a perfect score of 1. Some come a lot closer than others. You can see here on the map, Europe, Australia, Argentina, Chile have very high human development, as opposed to a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, very low human development, parts of Asia. The highest is Norway at 0.944, followed by Australia, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and the United States. Generally speaking, those who have the highest development scores have a lot of social programs in place to help people with things like life expectancy, literacy, and income. The lowest, places like Sierra Leone, Chad, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Niger has the lowest currently with 0.337. These tend to be countries where there's a lot of poverty, a lot of instability of the government. It's not very easy to provide services to people if your government is constantly in flux, or if you've been suffering from war. The latest scores did not have Syria on there, but I guarantee you Syria right now has a very low human development index score, which it used to have quite a high one. Vaccination rates were very high in Syria, and now due to the civil war there, we see epidemics like polio on the rise. And so human development is very closely linked with that economic development that we were talking about a minute ago. I want to make sure that we think about the term development critically, because development implies a single trajectory, that you are starting in one place and you're moving towards another. And generally speaking, that is from less consumption to more consumption, which we are going to talk a little bit about ecological footprints. And we are not going to be able to have everybody in the world consuming at the rate that Europeans do and that people in the United States do. We just don't have enough resources for it. It's also a very Western perspective because those countries who are considered most developed, for the most part, are the United States, Canada, and Europe. There is nothing that says that development is a single trajectory that all countries are going to follow this same path to this more European and Western model of life. Um, and again, that current trajectory is not sustainable on a global scale. Some countries are going to have to cut back, while other countries obviously are going to start using more resources as they strengthen their middle class and bring people out of poverty. Next, I wanted to briefly talk about ecological footprint and what we mean by that. Ecological footprint are the ecological assets that a given population requires to produce the natural resources it consumes. This includes plant-based food and fiber products, livestock and fish products, timber and other forest products, and fossil fuel use. Very often we hear ecological footprint just referring to fossil fuel use, but it refers to a bunch of other things as well. You may also hear the term carbon footprint, which is just referring to that fossil fuel use of coal, natural gas, and oil. Um, Carrying capacity is related. It is the number of people or other living organisms or crops that a region, ecosystem, planet can support without environmental degradation. We are currently globally using resources 50% faster than they are being replenished. So we kind of overshot our capacity quite a while ago. And if we stay on this current trajectory, we basically are going to need 3 Earths to support us. And right now, a big part of that is fossil fuel use. Fossil fuels are not a renewable energy. Regardless of how you feel about climate change, they're going to run out. They take millions of years to make. And we are going to have to find an alternative way to do that. And some of this is going to be just cutting down on our consumption and being more efficient. And so if we think about, we have ecological debtors. The US is one of them. We are using more ecological resources than we have currently. We do that A, through fossil fuel use, and B, from importing resources from other countries. Places like the Amazon in Brazil is one of the reasons why Brazil is an ecological creditor. Some countries are ecological debtors not because they have citizens who are using a ton of resources. It's just that their physical landscape makes it that they do not have very many resources. So a lot of places in North Africa, it's not the same circumstance as the US. The US has a ton of natural resources. A lot of those countries just do not have natural resources to use, and therefore they have to import a lot of things. The next thing I'm going to talk about is inequality, which I mentioned previously. Inequality can refer to multiple things. It can refer to income. It can refer to wealth, which is not the same thing as income, right? I could be born and have a ton of money in the bank from a trust, and I am wealthy, and this has nothing to do with my income. Or I could be working at a company as a CEO and have a very high income, but not necessarily have a lot of material wealth. Generally speaking, these two go hand in hand, but it's not always the same thing. It also can refer to opportunity. We like to think of ourselves in the US as the land of opportunity. No matter where you start out in the US, you can kind of pick yourself up by your bootstraps. That opportunity is not equal across all groups, though, and it certainly isn't equal globally. Access to things like education and healthcare. There's a lot of people who have much less opportunities to seek medical care when they need it, or access to things like fresh food. Um, this can be between individuals, but is usually discussed as being between groups. There's 2 videos that you're going to watch after this lecture about inequality. One is about inequality in the United States, and one is about inequality globally speaking. They are definitely left-leaning kind of public service announcements about inequality. However, they give a really good picture about what inequality looks like, which it's a lot more severe than most people realize, even in the United States. So a couple of big questions. How did humanity become developed or modern? And why are there such big gaps in wealth and development around the world? Like, why does a home in Lesotho look like it does on the left, while a home in San Diego, and this home in San Diego now would cost probably $1 million because we're in the middle of a big housing crisis. But why did this happen, right? Why are some countries so less developed than some other ones? And we're going to go through four things that contributed to that gap in wealth and development. So the first one is agriculture, right? So when we kind of became a post-hunter and hunting and gathering society, agriculture was discovered. And by discovered, we noticed that certain plants grew seasonally in certain places, and we were able to domesticate those plants and then subsequently domesticate animals. This happened about 10,000 years ago. I mentioned in the previous lecture that this happened when our climate stabilized. We could now have some consistency there in order to create this agricultural system. It originated in the Middle East, Egypt, China, Pakistan, Mesoamerica, and Peru. You can see at the bottom here, there is the confluence of the Euphrates and the Tigris River, which is the Fertile Crescent, the birth of big agriculture. It diffused over time. That's where it started, but it spread. And basically, if you had land where you could grow more food, right, you could sustain more of a population and potentially become more developed. Places that could not grow a lot of food, places that were more arid or more desert-like, didn't have that opportunity to grow as much food. And so when you have an opportunity to increase that food, you're essentially increasing your carrying capacity of your region, right? Before you were growing this consistent source of food, you were kind of just relying on what you could find. But now we have a system in place where we can grow more food and therefore we can have more people. And this resulted in permanent settlements, right? We started hanging out in the same place, started becoming less nomads. Not all of us, but a lot of people did. And then we had the birth of complex societies, right? It was that birth of agriculture where we could stay put, have a good idea of how much food we're going to get, have a growing population, and then we get cities that are formed. So here is a city which is Pueblo Bonito in New Mexico, which I highly recommend visiting. It's amazing and gorgeous, but there were plenty of cities like this in the Americas. You have to drive down a dirt road to get to this one. It is run by the Natural Park System, but we tend to gloss over these in the US and just tend to think of cities as things that happened after Europeans got here, but they were certainly going on before they were. And so that link between population and food, in agriculturally productive places, you have a very high population potential, such as in a place like the Philippines versus a place like Mongolia. Less productive places, less potential population. You just cannot grow enough food. You do not have enough resources in order to have many children and have them survive, unless a country can afford to import. And so that's what's happening a lot these days. You have areas that aren't particularly ecologically productive, but we can import that stuff from other places. The second thing that contributes to development is industrialization. And so that revolution occurred in Europe in the 1700s and moved onward to places like the United States. And so why did it develop there? Like, why did that start in Europe and give them such a leg up? They already had large populations from agriculture, so there's a lot of people already there to participate in this industrial revolution. They have the raw materials to do it, predominantly coal and certain metals, so that was available to them. That doesn't exist in all parts of the world. They also had a less powerful elite system. In Europe, there had been several revolutions, and so you have more chance for kind of this capitalist system to grow in these places because you don't have this feudal system anymore where you have these monarchies kind of controlling the entire economy. And so the results were these regions got urbanized, more people moved to cities earlier on. They had a higher standard of living. And obviously, that higher standard of living is all relative. You see at the top there a little girl working in a factory. There were certainly lots of children working in factories back then. And this is still diffusing today. So some countries are still going through this process. Some have gone through it recently. When we talk about Europe, we'll look at Eastern Europe, which used to be communist, that once the fall of the Berlin Wall, these countries kind of went through that revolution afterwards and had a bunch of economic growth. But pre-industrial places still, places like Niger, are still very poor, right? They're not doing all of this manufacturing. And the next thing that I want to talk about that contributed to that was colonialism, because there's a very strong reason why you have countries that may have a lot of natural resources that still have not been able to go through that process. And so, because European countries were able to explore and colonize. When we talk about Europe, we'll talk about how well situated they were to do that. Incredibly long coastline, lots of navigable rivers. So they were able to kind of set out from there much easier than in a lot of other places. And so they went to a bunch of other countries, imposed their culture, their government, and their commerce. They cut up the map of Africa here. You can see with no regard for who lived there or any type of ethnicities or languages. They just divided it up as they saw fit between themselves. Colonialism also led to the slave trade. You are going to watch an animation that is going to show the slave trade from West Africa to the Americas over the course of a few hundred years, and just how many ships came across and the amount of people that it took out of West Africa and just decimated many of those populations. There were two types of colonies. The first one was a settler colony. And so when Europeans got to countries in temperate climates or milder climates that looked a lot more like Europe, they stayed. They set up shop, they built houses, their population grew there. So the United States was a settler colony. South Africa, which has a large British and Dutch population, was a settler colony. Other colonies that were in tropical climates where Europeans didn't really want to migrate to, they set up these mercantile colonies. And so basically, there were Europeans living there, they were running the show, they did impose their government, but it was basically just a way to extract money and natural resources. And the effects of this still remain today. So if we look at the link between the colonizer and the colonized, and this is one of the reasons why this wealth gap still exists today, is you have England is going to export cotton, which is a raw material from India at discounted prices. Like this export was set up during colonization. And so tons of Indians now have to farm cotton. England is getting all of that cotton. That cotton is then used in England to manufacture goods. And those manufactured goods are then sold back to people in India. So the profit is really happening on the English side and not the Indian side, right? Because they're buying that raw material at a discounted price. And so England controls a monopoly on these goods, which are more profitable than the raw materials. So even after these countries gained independence, these economic systems were in place, and many of them have held fast to today, and you already had that wealth gap that was just set up and perpetuated. And so this lays the path for an export and natural resource based economy as opposed to a manufacturing economy. And a lot of this is changing in those emerging economies like India. We will see going forward that there's also a very strong relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. Like very often you have a lot of people of Indian descent living in England right now because they still have that connection. Um, But that natural resource-based economy in places like India, that's highly subject to market forces and external factors. So based upon some fluctuation in a global market for cotton, you can wind up with a lot of farmers in India putting themselves into severe debt or even unfortunately committing suicide due to factors beyond their control because they have gone bankrupt. So that's the first part of chapter 1. You're going to watch those short videos and then you're going to come back for the second part of chapter 3.